December 20, 1943. AB-17 Flying Fortress, designated Lucky Strike, dragged itself across the English Channel like a wounded animal refusing to die. The number. 3 engine was gone. Not just dead, gone, torn off by flak over Bremen and leaving a gaping wound in the wing. Hydraulic fluid painted red streaks along the fuselage. The ball turret hung at a sickening angle, its gunner already gone. By every manual, every regulation, every physics calculation the Army Air Forces had published, this bomber should have augured into the North Sea 20 minutes ago. But it didn't. Pilot Lieutenant Marcus Webb kept that crippled bird airborne through a combination of brute force, prayer, and something else. Something the ground crew had done to his plane 3 weeks earlier that wasn't in any manual. When Lucky Strike finally kissed the runway at RAF Bassingbourn, it did so on one landing gear leg, the other having refused to deploy because, technically, there was no hydraulic pressure left to deploy it. Webb skidded that fortress down the tarmac in a shower of sparks that could be seen from the control tower a mile away. The crash crews expected to pull out bodies. Instead, they found 8 men climbing out on their own power, shaken but alive. The 9th, that ball turret gunner, had been lost over the target, but everyone else made it home despite flying a plane that had, according to post-flight analysis, lost primary hydraulic function, suffered catastrophic fuel system damage, and experienced electrical failures that should have made controlled flight impossible. Group Commander Colonel James Albertson stood on that tarmac, staring at the wreckage, and asked the only question that mattered: how? The official answer would take months. The real answer was already working in a hangar 200 yards away, elbow deep in another B-17's engine cowling, making modifications that would have gotten him court-martialed if anyone had bothered to document what he was actually doing. See, the Army Air Forces in late 1943 had a problem they couldn't quite articulate in the after-action reports. Bombers were going down. That was expected. This was war over Nazi Germany, after all, and the Luftwaffe wasn't handing out participation trophies. But planes were going down from damage that shouldn't have been fatal. A single flak hit in the wrong spot, and a B-17 that could supposedly absorb punishment that would shred 3 fighters would just fall out of formation. Something was wrong with the design, but Boeing wasn't about to admit it. The Pentagon wasn't interested in hearing it, and crews were dying because of it. Lucky Strike's survival wasn't luck. It was proof that someone had figured out the flaw and fixed it, using methods that would make procurement officers have aneurysms. This is the story of how one mechanic's forbidden modifications turned the B-17 from a statistical death sentence on certain missions into the legendary survivor it's remembered as today. And it started with a guy who'd learned to fix things not in any technical school, but in a Depression-era garage in Pittsburgh, where the rule was simple: make it work or it doesn't get fixed. Staff Sergeant Paul Zuck wasn't supposed to be fixing airplanes. His Army Air Forces personnel file said he'd scored high enough on mechanical aptitude tests to warrant assignment to the motor pool, trucks, jeeps, the unglamorous machinery that kept an airbase running. But someone in the assignment office at Bassingbourn had looked at his civilian work history and made a lateral move that probably saved 100 lives. Before the war, Zuck had run a repair shop in Pittsburgh's Polish Hill neighborhood, where he'd kept coal trucks, delivery vans, and the occasional bootleggers, souped-up Ford, running on budgets that would make a poverty line look generous. He arrived at Bassingbourn in August 1943, 26 years old, with grease already under his fingernails, and an attitude about regulations that his commanding officers would alternately find infuriating and invaluable. His first week on the flight line, he watched a crew chief reject a B-17 for a cracked hydraulic line, standard procedure by the book, completely correct according to Technical Order 01-20-EG-2. The replacement part was on back order. The plane sat grounded. The mission went out one bomber short. Zuck asked why they couldn't bypass the damaged section and reroute through the secondary line. The crew chief looked at him like he'd suggested using baling wire to fix the wings. "That's not in the manual, Sergeant." Zuck's response, delivered in a Pittsburgh accent thick enough to cut with a wrench, became legendary in the maintenance section. The manual didn't grow up fixing trucks during the Depression. I did. Here's what made Zuck different from the mechanics who'd learned their trade in Army technical schools. Those guys could follow a technical order perfectly, execute repairs exactly as Boeing engineers had specified, and maintain a B-17 to factory specifications. Zuck could look at a system that was failing and ask a question the engineers apparently hadn't. What happens when this breaks over Germany and there's no parts depot at 20,000 feet? His genius wasn't in understanding how things were supposed to work. It was in understanding how they could still work when everything went wrong. By October, other mechanics had started noticing that planes Zuck serviced had a weird habit of coming back from missions they shouldn't have survived. A bomber he'd worked on took flak through the hydraulic bay, should have lost all landing gear control, but the pilot managed a wheels-down landing. Another bird lost primary electrical after a fighter attack, yet the instruments kept working long enough to get the navigator home. Coincidence? The crew chief said. Lucky coincidence. Zuck didn't believe in luck. He believed in redundancy, in backup systems, in routing critical functions through pathways that weren't in the Boeing blueprints, because Boeing had apparently never considered what happened when their beautiful, efficient, single point of failure designs met German 88mm flak. While other mechanics replaced parts, Zuck was redesigning systems on the fly, using scavenged components, borrowed tubing, and electrical connections that would have made an inspector weep. The other mechanics started calling him the plumber, because he was always rerouting something: hydraulic lines, fuel feeds, electrical bundles. He'd spend hours after official duty hours in the hangars, flashlight in his teeth, rewiring planes in ways that never appeared on the maintenance logs, because technically, what he was doing violated about 15 different Army regulations. When asked why he bothered, given that he could have sat in the motor pool drinking coffee and avoiding trouble, Zuck's answer was simple. Those guys fly the missions. Least I can do is make sure the plane doesn't kill them on the way home. The B-17 Flying Fortress was supposed to be indestructible. Boeing's marketing practically said so, and the early combat reports from 1942 seemed to confirm it. Fortresses came back from missions looking like flying cheese graters, holes punched through wings and fuselage, yet they kept flying. Crews nicknamed them the Flying Fortress for good reason. These things could absorb punishment that would atomize a B-24. But by late 1943, a disturbing pattern emerged in the lost statistics that nobody wanted to talk about. Planes weren't just getting shot down by concentrated fighter attacks or direct flak hits to critical areas. They were going down from single points of failure, one hit in the wrong spot, and a bomber worth $200,000, and 10 trained airmen would spiral out of formation and disappear. The 8th Air Force was losing bombers at a rate of about 5% per mission by autumn 1943. Do the math. A crew's odds of surviving a required 25-mission tour were essentially a coin flip. Something was killing B-17s that shouldn't have been fatal, and it took mechanics, like Zook, actually looking at the wreckage to figure out what. The problem was hydraulics. The B-17's hydraulic system controlled everything that mattered when you were trying to not die. Landing gear, brakes, wing flaps, and most critically, the turret systems that let gunners track fighters. Boeing had designed an efficient system with primary lines running through the fuselage in tidy bundles, because that's what you do when you're designing for peacetime efficiency. But efficient meant concentrated. One piece of flak through the wrong 6 inches of fuselage, and you lost hydraulic pressure to multiple systems simultaneously. A bomber could have 3 functioning engines, intact wings, and a healthy crew. But without hydraulics, you couldn't lower landing gear. And a B-17 doing a belly landing on an English runway was often a B-17 that caught fire. Then there was the fuel system, which had its own special way of killing people. The B-17 carried 2,780 gallons of high-octane aviation fuel in 9 different tanks, 5 in the wings, 4 in the fuselage. The feed system was designed so fuel flowed from outer wing tanks inward, maintaining balance. Sensible engineering. Except the fuel lines between tanks ran through areas that were absolutely in the cone of fire when German fighters made beam attacks from 3 o'clock or 9 o'clock positions. A 20-millimeter cannon round through a fuel line didn't just mean you lost fuel, though you did, catastrophically. It meant you now had aviation gas spraying inside an airframe where hot metal, electrical sparks, and open air at -40 degrees created the perfect conditions for either fire or vapor lock. Zook had noticed something the engineering reports missed. Planes that went down from mysterious causes often showed pre-impact fuel system anomalies. Pilots reported rough engines, then engine failure, then the whole plane would shake itself apart or catch fire. Post-crash analysis, when there was anything left to analyze, kept mentioning fuel contamination or air in the lines. What was happening was simple once you saw it. Flak or bullets would damage a fuel line. Air would get into the system. Engines would start dying in sequence because they were all fed from the same compromised network, and the bomber would go down not because it was too damaged to fly, but because it was choking itself to death. Boeing's engineers had built an airplane that worked beautifully under ideal conditions. But combat over Germany in 1943 wasn't ideal conditions. It was an environment where every system needed to assume it would be damaged and still had to work anyway. The B-17's Achilles heel wasn't armor or firepower. It was single point of failure design philosophy. And that's what Zook started fixing, one unauthorized modification at a time. What Zook did wasn't technically illegal. It was worse than that. It was unauthorized field modification of combat aircraft systems, which meant if a plane crashed and investigators traced the failure to his handiwork, he'd be facing a court-martial for negligent homicide. But Zook had done the math differently. If he did nothing, the planes crashed anyway. At least this way they had a chance. The core of his forbidden fix was brutally simple. Create redundancy where Boeing hadn't. Take that hydraulic system with its neat, efficient, single-bundle design and turn it into a mess of backup lines that looked like a plumber's nightmare, but functioned when the primary system took a hit. Zook started scavenging hydraulic tubing from damaged aircraft in the salvage yard, stuff that was technically supposed to be sent back for official recycling. He'd cut sections of undamaged line, test them for pressure integrity using a hand pump he'd jury-rigged, and then install them as bypass routes in active aircraft. Here's how it worked in practice. A standard B-17 had one main hydraulic line running from the pump to the landing gear actuators. Zook would tap into that line at 2 points, one forward near the cockpit, one aft near the radio room, and run a secondary line along a different path, usually tucked along the fuselage stringers where it was protected by structural members. Then he'd install manual isolation valves at each junction point using parts cannibalized from damaged bombers. If the primary line took a hit and lost pressure, the pilot could reach down. Zook mounted the valves within arm's reach and manually switched to the backup line. It wasn't elegant, it added weight. It violated Technical Order Z01-20EG-2, Section 4, Paragraph 12, Subsection C. And it meant the difference between landing on wheels or sliding down the runway on the belly and praying. The fuel system fix was even more radical. Zook couldn't prevent fuel lines from getting hit. That was a fact of flying through flak. But he could prevent a hit from cascading into complete system failure. He started installing crossover valves between tank systems using fuel petcocks designed for ground refueling operations. Officially, these valves were only supposed to be used on the ground. Zook installed them in flight-accessible positions and documented them on maintenance forms as refueling system check valves. Technically true. Deliberately vague. Now, when a fuel line took damage, pilots could isolate the compromised tank and reroute fuel flow from intact tanks directly to the engines that needed it. But the modification that really saved lives involved the electrical system. B-17S had a primary electrical bus that powered everything from instruments to turret motors. One hit to that bus, and you were flying dark. No instruments, no radio, no gun turrets. Zook started running secondary power lines from the auxiliary generator directly to critical systems, bypassing the main bus entirely. He'd hide these lines inside existing cable bundles, so they looked like factory wiring until you actually traced where they went. He used a different color of insulation, yellow instead of the standard black, so pilots would know which breakers controlled the emergency backup systems. The brilliance of Zook's approach was that he wasn't inventing new technology. Everything he used was already on the aircraft or in the parts bins. He was just rearranging the puzzle pieces in ways Boeing's engineers hadn't considered, because they'd been optimizing for manufacturing efficiency, not combat survivability. A bomber coming off the Seattle production line in 1943 was built to be assembled quickly by workers who'd been housewives 6 months earlier. Zook's modifications required a skilled mechanic who understood systems theory and wasn't afraid to deviate from the blueprint when the blueprint was getting people killed. By January 1944, Zook had quietly modified 17 B-17s in the 351st Bomb Group. He never advertised it. He never wrote it up. He just did the work during night maintenance shifts, when fewer officers were around to ask uncomfortable questions, and those 17 bombers were coming home from missions at a rate that was starting to look statistically impossible. February 8, 1944. Captain Ronald Fletcher, engineering officer for the 351st Bomb Group, was having a very bad morning that was about to get worse. He'd been doing routine maintenance inspections. the kind where you randomly pull aircraft from the flight line and verify they match their technical documentation. When he opened the hydraulic access panel on a B-17 called Devil's Daughter and found plumbing that absolutely should not exist. Fletcher wasn't stupid. He'd been an aeronautical engineering student at MIT before the war, and he could read a blueprint. What he was looking at wasn't on any Boeing blueprint he'd ever seen. Secondary hydraulic lines running through non-standard routes, manual isolation valves installed in locations that required custom bracketry, fuel crossover connections that used parts from what appeared to be 3 different aircraft, and all of it done with a level of craftsmanship that suggested this wasn't some sloppy field expedient. This was deliberate, thought-out modification. He found Zook in Hangar 3, working on an engine swap. "Sergeant, we need to talk about Devil's Daughter's hydraulic system." Zook didn't even look up from the cowling he was torquing. "What about it?" Fletcher pulled out his inspection clipboard. "What about it? What about the fact that there are approximately 40 feet of unauthorized hydraulic line installed in non-standard routing with manually operated valves that aren't in the technical orders?" Zook set down his wrench, wiped his hands on a rag that was somehow dirtier than his hands, and gave Fletcher a look that was equal parts tired and defiant. "You want the official answer, or the real one?" Fletcher's response was immediate. "Both. Starting with how long you've been doing this, and how many aircraft are affected. 17 planes. That was the number that made Fletcher's blood pressure spike. 17 aircraft in active service with undocumented modifications to primary flight systems. The regulatory violation was staggering. Zook could be court-martialed. Fletcher himself could face disciplinary action for not catching it sooner. But then Fletcher asked the question that changed everything. Have any of these 17 aircraft experienced hydraulic failure? Zook pulled out a grease-stained notebook from his coverall pocket, his personal maintenance log that wasn't part of any official record. 3 of them took flak hits to primary hydraulic lines. All 3 made it home on the backup system. Devil's Daughter landed on her own gear 2 weeks ago, after 80mm took out her primary line over Frankfurt. Pilot didn't even know he was on backup until I showed him the damage post-flight. Fletcher did the math in his head. 3 catastrophic hydraulic hits, 0 losses. The standard statistics said at least 2 of those planes should have been written off. By noon, Fletcher had escalated to Group Commander Albertson, the same colonel who'd watched Lucky Strike's miraculous landing back in December. By 1400 hours, Albertson was in the hangar, personally inspecting Zook's modifications, with Fletcher providing technical narration. And by 1600 hours, there was a very uncomfortable meeting happening in the group operations office where the question on the table was whether to court-martial Zook or give him a medal. Major Henry Watkins from 8th Air Force Engineering Staff arrived on February 10th to conduct a formal investigation. He spent 3 days crawling through Zook's modified aircraft, photographing installations, reviewing maintenance logs, and interviewing pilots. His preliminary report, filed February 13th, contained a paragraph that probably took him an hour to write, because it essentially admitted the Army Air Forces had been sending crews into combat with preventably vulnerable aircraft. While Sergeant Zook's modifications are unauthorized and violate standing technical orders, preliminary analysis suggests these changes address systemic vulnerability in hydraulic and fuel system design that may contribute to combat losses. Recommend against punitive action, pending engineering evaluation, and controlled testing. That paragraph saved Zook's career. But it also opened a door nobody in the Pentagon wanted opened. The door that led to questions about how many crews had died because Boeing's design prioritized production efficiency over combat survivability. Albertson made a command decision that probably bent a few regulations itself. Zook wouldn't face charges, but he also couldn't modify any more aircraft until the engineering evaluation was complete. And in the meantime, those 17 bombers would keep flying missions because even the brass could read survival statistics. Major Watkins returned to Bassingbourn on March 3, 1944, with 2 Boeing engineers, a team of Army Air Force's technical specialists, and a mandate that essentially read, "Prove this works," or "Prove it's dangerous. But do it fast, because we're bleeding bombers over Germany." What followed was the most informal, high-stakes engineering validation in military aviation history, testing unauthorized field modifications under actual combat conditions, while trying to figure out if you should be documenting this as innovation or evidence for a court-martial. The Boeing engineers, both civilians under military contract, were appalled at first sight. The lead engineer, a man named Carlson, who'd worked on the original B-17 design in Seattle, spent his first hour at Bassingbourn using words like contamination risk and pressure regulation concerns and potential catastrophic failure modes. He stood in front of a partially disassembled bomber, pointing at Zook's bypass lines, explaining to Watkins why this couldn't possibly work because it violated fundamental hydraulic system design principles established by people with engineering degrees. Zook, standing there in grease-stained coveralls, let him finish, then asked a question. "When's the last time you flew a combat mission?" Carlson bristled. "I'm an engineer, not a pilot." Zook nodded. "Right. So you designed this system in Seattle where the worst thing that happens is a failed pressure test. I maintain these birds when they come back with holes in them. Different perspective. What Watkins proposed was radical. Instrument some of Zook's modified aircraft with additional pressure gauges, flow meters, and monitoring equipment, then send them on actual combat missions while recording system performance. In any sane procurement process, this would take months of ground testing first. But this was March 1944. The air war over Germany was hitting its crescendo, and the 8th Air Force was losing an average of 6 bombers per mission. They didn't have months. Between March 5th and March 18th, 5 of Zook's modified B-17s flew a total of 11 combat missions to targets including Berlin, Brunswick, and Friedrichshafen. Each aircraft carried additional instrumentation that recorded hydraulic pressure, fuel flow rates, and electrical system performance throughout the mission. 3 of those bombers took battle damage. All 5 came home. The data was irrefutable. On the mission to Friedrichshafen on March 18th, a bomber called Memphis Belle II, one of Zook's modified aircraft, took an 80-atom flak burst that shredded the primary hydraulic line exactly where Boeing's design had it running along the bomb bay. The instrumentation recorded primary system pressure dropping to 0 in 4.2 seconds. Standard procedure. The aircraft should have been unable to control landing gear, flaps, or brakes. But Memphis Belle II's pilot, following briefing instructions Zook had personally given him, reached down and rotated 3 manual isolation valves. The backup system kicked in. Pressure stabilized at 85% of normal, lower than ideal, but well within operational range. The bomber stayed in formation, completed its bomb run, and landed at Bassingbourn on its own gear, while engineers on the ground watched their monitoring equipment and realized they were seeing something that shouldn't exist, a hydraulic system that survived a catastrophic failure. Carlson, the Boeing engineer, watched the data playback in stunned silence. Finally, he turned to Watkins and said something that probably hurt to admit. "This shouldn't work. The pressure dynamics are all wrong, the flow rates are inadequate, and there's no proper filtration in the bypass system, but it does work. I don't understand why, but it works." Zook, standing in the back of the briefing room, offered an explanation that probably didn't make it into the official report. "It works because I designed it to work when everything's already gone to hell. Your system works great until it doesn't. Mine works badly all the time, but it keeps working." The testing phase produced 47 pages of technical data, 11 mission after-action reports, and a conclusion that Air Force engineering couldn't ignore. Zook's modifications increased system survivability without compromising primary system function. Translation: he'd made the planes safer without making them worse. On March 22nd, Watkins filed his final report with a recommendation that would ripple through every B-17 squadron in England: authorize field modification based on Zook's design, and begin training mechanics across all 8th Air Force groups. April 1944. While the Pentagon argued about official procurement channels, and Boeing negotiated retrofit contracts that wouldn't materialize until June at the earliest, something else was happening on airfields across East Anglia. Mechanics were talking to each other, and when mechanics talk, they don't discuss policy. They discuss what works. Staff Sergeant Mike Delacroix from the 303 Bomb Group at Molesworth had heard about Zook's modifications through a crew chief who'd transferred from Bassingbourn. By April 8th, Delacroix was at Bassingbourn during a supply run, notebook in hand, asking Zook to walk him through the hydraulic bypass installation. Zook spent 3 hours showing him every connection point, every valve placement, every routing decision. Delacroix went back to Molesworth and started modifying aircraft that night. Within a week, the 303rd had 5 bombers running Zook's system. Technical Sergeant James Wu at Thorpe Abbotts heard about it from Delacroix. By April 15th, the 100th Bomb Group, the bloody 100th, which had the worst loss rate in the 8th Air Force, had mechanics working double shifts to install bypass systems on every operational aircraft. They didn't wait for authorization. They didn't file modification requests. They just did it because they'd watched too many bombers go down from damage that should have been survivable. This was grassroots engineering revolution, spreading through informal networks and, while official channels debated committee structures. Master Sergeant Robert Chen at Kimballton started keeping statistics that the Air Force wasn't tracking yet. In March, before any modifications, the 379th Bomb Group had a 14% abort rate from mechanical failures during missions. By late April, with 12 aircraft running Zook's modifications, that rate dropped to 6%. Chen's logbook, unofficial, unrecognized, showed something even more striking. Modified aircraft that took battle damage were 3 times more likely to return to base than unmodified birds taking similar damage. The official authorization came through on April 28, 1944, as Technical Order 012-0EG2-127, Field Modification for Enhanced Hydraulic System, Redundancy in B-17F and B-17G aircraft.